So how many of you, all right, I want to preface this. When I was younger and I wanted to read the Bible, because everybody said, oh, this is the greatest book, you're going to learn so much from it, I started reading the Bible with Genesis. Whoops. Yeah, anybody else do the same thing at one point in time or another where you're going, okay, I know I should read the Bible. I'm going to read it at Genesis. Okay, who made it through Genesis? Raise your hand. Who made it through Exodus? Who made it through Numbers? All right, well, we got a few. Nice, because that is where I lost it. I made it through part way through Exodus, and I got bored for one, confused for another, and just kind of went, how does this even relate to my life today? And then it got put down until another time. So I don't know if that's familiar for you or not, but that is kind of where we find ourselves today, is with the book of Joshua. It's at that point after you might have lost a little bit of interest. It's beyond the first 5 books of the Bible, which are known as the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch, or the Torah. It's the books of the law are the first ones. And if you made it through Leviticus, bless you. You probably learned a little bit about that last week and just all of the commands and laws that they had. It can be a lot to read through. So today we're beginning the first of the history books, Joshua. And it's going to be difficult if you haven't already read it. But the goal of the history books, starting with this one and moving forward, isn't so much to reveal history as it is to reveal God. God has been present with the people from the very beginning and wants to continue to be in relationship. And I should probably start my slide. So this chapter is called The Battle Begins, if that's any indication of where we're going. And to help set the scene, I want to start with the beginning of Joshua. So after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, "My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon, and as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all of the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them." So what do you notice here? What are some of the things you might pick up on? So God made a promise with the Israelites in the previous chapters, promised them the land flowing with milk and honey. They've been wandering in the wilderness all this last week, it was 40 years of the wilderness wanderings under Moses' leadership. And they have finally reached the promised land. It's interesting that, did you talk about that last week, about how Moses didn't get to enter with them? Okay, good. You already covered that. Excellent. But imagine having led the people for so long to get to the point where you're like, yes, we're finally here, and then not being able to enter it. So God appoints Joshua. Joshua is said to be from the house of Levi, so one of the 12 tribes of Israel, which was not one of the most important houses. So for him to get this role was kind of a big deal. I mean, we don't see it as much in Scripture, but like him being Moses' assistant probably meant that he wasn't the strongest or the smartest or the one that was likely to get the job, but Joshua is the one that God chose. Let's see here. And it should also be noted that by this point in time in the wilderness wanderings is that some of their identity markers have since changed from when they came out of Egypt. So they came out of Egypt and they're kind of a wandering people who had been enslaved for a long time. They're kind of trying to figure out the new ropes, all of the things that we've been talking about the last couple of chapters. But by now, they're more grounded. They're more landed. They have land, as we're seeing in Joshua. And they're empowered by God to become what will be a military threat to the nations around them. As they enter Canaan, the people who are there, and they are inhabited, perceive them with fear and trembling wherever they go, and those who oppose them will fall to their knees. I mean, it's kind of the PC way of saying this isn't going to be good. And even though they have this newfound power, it should also be noted that the Israelites don't lose some of their key attributes that probably we all have. A little bit of stubbornness, a little bit of grumbling, a little bit of rebellion. But I think we'll get to that soon enough. So here we have Joshua, who is charged with leading the people of Israel. And does anybody remember what the word Israel means? I wrestled with God. It comes from the story in Genesis back when Jacob was going to meet his brother Esau. And he's at the river waiting for him ahead of his family and ahead of the troops. And there's a man there whom he wrestles with. And in the morning, the man strikes his hip, but he is the one who is victorious. And he says, I need to know your name. And he realizes that he has been wrestling with God all night. And God blesses him and renames him Israel, which means I've wrestled with God. And that becomes the name for the people. So this is the people that Joshua is leading. Now, they've reached the promised land. Joshua was previously a spy in the former chapters, so he knew what kind of risk that this land came with. It was a land flowing with milk and honey and produce and ways for them to be sustainable on their own. And he also knows that it is inhabited by many other nations. Numbers 13 refers to them as a giant people who were well prepared to fight. One historian describes it. From personal observation, Joshua knew that the Canaanites and others were vigorous people who lived in strong, fortified cities. Frequent battles kept their warriors in trim fighting condition, and for the most part, the land was mountainous, a fact that would make regular war maneuvers very difficult. So again, there's more of the unknown that is coming up through territory very unfamiliar to them, and God reminds Joshua repeatedly to remain strong and courageous. We read it once in here, but it shows up multiple times throughout the book. Be strong and courageous. So just out of curiosity, who is the strongest person that you know? And what makes them strong? Right now, single parents are the strongest in my mind. I mean, I have the advantage of having a spouse who will come home tonight and will take over some of the, 4 a.m. wake-up calls. But single parents who don't get that break are pretty dang strong in my mind. So who's the strongest person you know, and what makes them strong? Your mother. And what makes her strong? She always kept going. Yeah. Her faith kept her going. I saw a hand over here.
We had a friend that moved to Minneapolis, and he got to really know the area. And he started every different thing for Christians. And he was just, everything he talked about was the Lord.
Nice. So a friend who moved to Minneapolis who was just really passionate about faith and started many different things in the area and just kept on going. I love it. I saw another hand. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say my mom too, because she's been through a lot of loss, like all her family and best friends, and she's 95, and she just keeps trucking along and gets through everything that
Yeah.
she's faith-filled.
Your mom who is 95 who has been through a lot and just very faith-filled and keeps going. Yeah. Yeah.
Diane Erickson,
Diane Erickson.
taking care of her husband, plus her 2 parents.
Yeah. Yeah.
day all the time,
Taking care of her spouse and parents.
still leading our groups and doing other things.
Oh, and leading word for women. Oh, yeah, exactly. I saw another hand right over this way. Melanie.
I was going to say my mother also, she was widowed at age 43 and had 4 children at home.
You're,
Had been a stay-at-home mom and she had to find a job and family.
so your mother who was widowed at age 43 with 4 kids, who had been a stay-at-home mother and had to find a job and provide for her kids, yes. Notice all these women who are coming up as strong. Let's not forget that part right here. But God's telling Joshua to be strong and courageous. And I can imagine that he really needed that reminder. I mean, think about it. He's following in Moses' shoes. Moses has been kind of a big figure in the faith. And if anybody here has followed in the shoes of greatness, I mean, we clearly have awesome mothers here. There may be some times where you go, oh, am I good enough? And this reminder to be strong and courageous. And I think what this also is saying is the kind of strength that God asks of Moses. It's not, I mean, even in the stories that we heard here, it's not the kind of strength that you see in like a Marvel movie, for instance. I mean, nobody mentioned Tony Stark. But it's those moments of keeping going, looking out for the greater good, protecting, helping, and all of the ways that we are connected. And so I think that's also really important to notice that strength can also look like humility and the ways in which love can be known. I mean, if you were in worship this last weekend, how we have this God of love who will always lead us towards love. And that is still evident as we continue the story as well. There's an interesting part of Joshua that wasn't really tapped into too much in the story, but I find it really interesting. So I'm pulling out a couple of the key verses here. But Joshua 3 says, when the people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan, so this is when they are entering the promised land, the priests bearing the ark of the covenant were in front of the people. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of the harvest. So when those who bore the ark had come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the edge of the waters flowing from above stood still, rising up in a single heap far off at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, while those flowing towards the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, were wholly cut off. Then the people crossed over opposite Jericho, while all Israel was crossing over on dry ground. The priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant and the Lord stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation finished crossing over the Jordan. What do you notice here? It's the parting of the waters again. It's this grand miracle that has far less trumpet and fanfare as when they crossed over the last time. So they escaped Egypt by crossing the Red Sea on dry land because God parted the waters. And God is parting the waters yet again as they enter into this new chapter of their life. Yes, Cindy?
I was so impressed that not that he parted the waters, but that the land was dry.
Yes.
The bottom of a lake, a river, is not dry.
Yeah, so Cindy said she's impressed that the land was dry because when the waters parted, river beds are not often dry when there's no water on them. They're often pretty soggy. Yeah. It's a miracle and a reminder that God is going with them. God is faithful to this promise God has made with them and is right there alongside in the grandest of ways. So once they crossed over into the promised land, they realized there are the people there, and the first city in the promised land is Jericho, as mentioned in this verse. Now, anybody remember from Sunday school the story of Jericho? There's a little bit of Jericho. Yep, it's a big fortified walled city that is the Canaanite people, and they're trying to figure out what do we do. So Joshua sends 2 spies to go and search the city. And remember that they are the people of Israel. It's no longer this like oppressed people, but when they enter, the people of Canaan were like, oh, we've heard about what has happened in your lives. We've heard about how God, the God, is with you. There's a lot of fear and trembling by the Canaanites. And so when they enter the city, they end up meeting Rahab. And she is a woman of mystery and tarnished reputation. Does anybody know what her profession is from reading this story? She is called a harlot, a prostitute, an innkeeper. And when the soldiers are looking for them, they see her, and she is really a woman of faith because she says, I know what God has done for you. And the account she gives is from 40 years earlier. Now, can you imagine what that would have been like to say, hey, I know what happened to your people 40 years ago, how God was with you. And this was an age before Google. It's not like she sat on her phone before bed and went, who are these guys coming here? Like, where do they come from? She didn't have access to that. So, there was something brewing in her as she helped them out. I have to give just a little thought to this, but her reputation as being a prostitute and a harlot, what does that bring up for us? Do we look at prostitutes favorably? No. It's interesting that is the profession that gets named and called out. I mean, I think there's a purpose that will come up later, but one of the things I want to help us think about is the ways in which we talk about it. Because what if instead they said that she was a sex worker versus a prostitute? Does that have a different connotation? Is she doing it to provide for her family? That's not always the impression we get when we hear the word prostitute. We think we think wanton and lustful, but really, she may have just been trying to provide for her family. It's just a thought. It's neither here nor there. Either way, it shows that in the hierarchy of society, kings and soldiers up here, she was way down here. I mean, it's said that she probably lived in the walls of this giant fortified city because that is where the poorest of the poor lived, because it was a space with shelter that didn't require a lot of room, and she had family there, and the innkeeping was kind of connected with her profession. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that we can speculate, that we can figure out or know, but she's kind of considered lowly in society. And we also know that we have a God who likes to lift up the lowly, likes to be present with the lowly. And so that's why I want to have us start to imagine, what if she was just trying to provide for her family rather than being this person who was bad who gets changed to good. She can be good all along. All right, now where is my lines? So she helps them out. The soldiers come. They're there, and they're like, where are these spies from Israel? And she's like, I saw them, but they already left, so you better go catch them before the gates close. And they're just kind of hiding on the rooftop at that point. And what she asks for in return for saving their lives, because they really only had two jobs, stay safe and to get a layout of the city. She asks for her and her family to be spared if anything were to happen. So then she also becomes a pillar of faithfulness. One of the scriptures says, I know that the Lord, in her voice, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the dread of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. That's 40 years ago. And what you did to the two kings of the Amorites, whom you utterly destroyed. The Lord your God is indeed God in heaven above and on earth below. So this is what happens right before the fall of Jericho. And now this is the story, the fall of Jericho is the story that gets told to kids in Sunday school. Anybody remember learning this as a kid? I mean, there are songs that go with it. Joshua 6 says, was there a question? Okay. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, see, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its kings and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city at once. Thus you shall do for 6 days with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make the long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and all the people shall charge straight ahead. What a wild story. That is not how you conquer a city. It's a miracle. God is saying, hey, I am here with you, and here is this unlikely way to conquer the city. Can you imagine? I mean, this isn't military warfare. You don't circle a city silently for 6 days and shout on the 7th day after a trumpet. And then, at that, I believe they also, the next part is when all the people shall charge straight ahead, this is conveniently where Sunday school ends. They charge ahead, they find Rahab and her family, they get them out, and then everything gets destroyed. All of the people get destroyed. And then if you keep reading, they all get circumcised. Do you remember that part in the story? Definitely not military warfare if you do this big conquest and then you're laid up for 3 days healing. Kind of a fun. But this is the part where it gets really hard, isn't it? I mean, how could God command the people to destroy everything and everyone? It's hard trying to reckon with this view of God. One of the things I learned about in preparing for this is the command that comes from God in these verses was known as harem warfare. And it's not harem as in like a harem in the Middle East filled with women. I believe it's H-E-R-E-M. But it's a Hebrew word that was translated to devoted for destruction. And it's usually the word that was behind the extermination of the different cities that they go to. Because, yes. Yeah. I'm getting there. I got that coming up soon. All right. But it was this word that meant for the complete and utter destruction. And one of the ways we can make sense of that, because it's horrifying to not allow any possible survivors as God gives them victory in battle. It creates this impression of ethnic cleansing and genocide. These are very tough images. But the purpose of warfare in the ancient Near East, outside of this, would have been conquest, subjugation. So like the kings who were not Israel would go in, conquer a city, they would kill the able-bodied men who could fight, and take the women and children as part of the booty, right? We kind of sort of know that because that feels more like modern warfare. But what this kind of warfare was, where it was the killing of everybody, meant it was changing a societal order by also killing the women and the children in the way this story is presented, meant that they couldn't be enslaved. They couldn't be subjugated. And so God was trying to lead them towards things that would lead them closer to love, even though this is really hard to comprehend. God was trying to say, hey, the ways in which military conquests are right now are not good for you, are not good for humanity, and I don't like it. Now, what God does, I don't think I agree with. This is the part where I'm very much going to be losing my words because I'm still wrestling with how do I make sense of this image of God. And so if you're wrestling with that too, know that you're in good company. These chapters are very, very hard. God tells them, and in the fall of Jericho, God tells them to kill everyone. But who makes it out? Rahab and her family. So even in the midst of this, there's already an exception. Even in the midst of this, God is saying, oh, Rahab is on the side of love and therefore is coming out of it. The one who would have been considered the least likely to make it out alive gets to come out alive. Remember, we're reading the Bible here literally instead of literally. So I'm trying to make some connections to help make sense of it. And if you disagree with me, that's okay. This is much better in small group than it is in lecture form, believe me. And there's also controversy of Jericho actually being inhabited during this time frame. As it says in your field guide, quite honestly, I find that really hopeful, especially if we are to read this literally instead of literally. Because to hopefully believe that these didn't actually happen in the way that they happened can help me believe in a God who's trying to give an overarching lesson without the actual death of people. Because what we're hearing in the story of Joshua is this leader who fills Moses' shoes, who is trying to be strong and courageous and is faithful to what God says. So as a literary device, Joshua is actually a very good leader because he's not putting himself first. Nowhere in this chapter does Joshua become king of the Israelites. Joshua lets God be king of the Israelites, even as God is doing things that are questionable by our standards. And that, I think, is the point of the story, is that part of being strong and courageous is humility and faithfulness, and the faithfulness to God. All right, now I'm really losing my words. Any questions here? Yeah, Chris.
I think another way you can look at the destruction is that this is a book that was written, and we have hyperbole here.
Yes.
Extreme exaggeration. So the authors of Joshua, written long after, are probably, it's a way of expressing in a literary sense what God was doing.
Yes. So Chris is saying that this is a literary way to express what God was doing using hyperbole. I mean, also notice the miraculousness of the parting of the seas. Can that be part of the hyperbole, but in a good way? Yes. Cindy.
I went to Israel and went to where Jericho was supposed to be, and they did have the stones that were on the wall. Some of them were going around, but as far as the people there, I think what he wanted to do was eliminate people that worshipped other gods that the Israelites might marry and be with.
That's what that's so.
And I don't have any trouble believing that because of Noah and the ark.
Okay, so Cindy said she went to Israel in the part where Jericho is, and there's stones on the ground to show where it is. There is discrepancy with historians of when those stones had fallen, and kind of if it was in this time frame or not. But that's part of the story. Part of the story is that God wanted to eliminate those who were putting their faith in things that weren't God, and that we saw that before with Noah and the ark. I think that also gets to this idea of God as love, because so if God is, this is where it gets really complicated, because we believe in a God who is love. And then we see God do this destruction, and we're kind of going, what the HE double hockey sticks? I mean, that might be an actual note in my story Bible. But one of the ways we can make sense of it maybe is that if we think about how actions have consequences, sometimes the act of love doesn't always look loving. So bear with me here. I mean, we think about the parent who has the teenager who's been out after curfew. They get grounded because they broke the rules, but you still love them. We think about, and they don't necessarily experience it as love at the time. We think about the family member who has an addiction, who needs an intervention. The intervention does not feel like love, but the family doing it is because they want to have a good relationship. They want their loved one to be healthy and happy. Oh, a fierce love? Yeah, a fierce love. And so I think that might be part of the hyperbole here, is that we have a God of love who fiercely wants us to worship God and to do things that are loving rather than to, worship sin, for instance. And so the Canaanites weren't necessarily worshiping sin, or their worship of other gods was as bad as the ways in which they were not loving with one another. So as we talk about the military view beforehand, if like the kings were on the throne and everything was to support the kings, and there were those who were being oppressed or even forced into sex work to make ends meet, that's not a loving way of being. And God's saying, I want you to be a community that is so grounded and rooted in love and faithfulness. And that's where we kind of get some of these stories, if that helps to make any sense of this. Yeah, Gail. We have a long way to go. I apologize. It's going to be a slog.
No, I mean to be that kind of city.
We have a long way to go to be that kind of city. Exactly.
That kind of church.
We do. And so in Joshua, we see them following God's word. We see even more of the Canaanite conflicts. We see city after city fall. We see the kings all fall in this. And that's a mark of faithfulness. And then next week, get ready for next week. It's going to go bad again, because I think that's part of our human nature, is we like that hierarchy. We have a long way to go as a church and as a people. And I mean, part of Israel and also our identity is stubbornness, grumbling. I mean, it's part of not being God. And so we constantly need these reminders. We need to be reminded of the God of love, so that way we can work towards, redemption to some extent. Which is also why in the Christian tradition we need a Savior, Jesus. Let's see, what do I have here? I'm running out of time. So this also makes me wonder, how do we define justice? In which we already got to my big point there, kind of talking about the actions and consequences, but the ways in which we talk about justice as community. I mean, in Exodus and Numbers, we have some retributive justice, where it's the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that's kind of how humans like to make sense of the world. I was talking to somebody before this, pettiness, when somebody wrongs you and you decide to be petty in return rather than just kind of letting it slide depending on what the occasion is, way less than violence, still is very much a reality. I mean, I know my petty moments, that's for sure. So that's kind of how we're wired, but that's not what God is calling us to. You move towards restorative justice next, where it's about repairing the harm and rebuilding relationships. I mean, ways in which we know about that in our world today is through mediation, counseling, listening to the tough stories of how you've been hurt or how you've been the one hurting. And then it leads towards redemptive justice, total restoration. And we see Jesus as the ultimate example of redemptive justice. So one of the ways it's easier to think about is retributive justice is what's done to you, the eye for an eye. Restorative justice is what's done for you. And redemptive justice is what is done in you. And these are just kind of some ways, because I think the word justice is a very loaded word. I have to be very careful when I use that word, especially in the political realm we find ourselves in. But it's not a political word. It is a word that God wants us to be just. And what does that justness look like? So hopefully that helps get this in those kind of terms. And I think what it leads to is God is trying to call us to systems that don't oppress others, that look out for those who are barely scraping by, and to find ways for wholeness in community. All right. We got Joshua's farewell at the end of the chapter. I find this part to be really comical. Speaking of hyperbole. So he lives to be 110. Okay, fine. Like years in the Bible I can kind of just roll with. But before he died, he recited all 5 books of the book of Moses. All of the curses and the blessings, everything that Moses had like kind of ever shared with them, he recites it on his deathbed to help the Israelites stay strong in the faith. be strong and be courageous. And God was with him through his entire life. I mean, these stories show God with him even in ways that are hard to comprehend. And he leaves them off to go on to next week. And anytime where humans are left to their own devices, as we have learned and will learn, things will get interesting yet again. The other question I have for you today as we conclude this time is, where do we find hope in this story? It might feel difficult. And I think, at least for me, it makes me question and kind of wrestle with the things that God is and the things that God is not. And that we need a fierce God, as Cheryl mentioned, who is so actively in love with us that will actively pull us away from the things that want to destroy us. Yeah. Joshua won all the battles. Yes, and there are miracles in there, and we too can have miracles today, absolutely. I think it's also important to recognize that, like, with Joshua, he doesn't skirt away from the tough stuff. And I think that's one of human tendencies, is to only focus on the good things and the positive things. And kind of what Joshua is calling us to is to wrestle with the rough things, so that way we don't reenact them. Now, there are ways this book has been used in history as a way of more triumphalism, and using it as we're strong and courageous, we're going to go pillage all the cities. I mean, it feels like an archaic sentence. The book of Joshua was used in the construction of apartheid in South Africa as one of the bases for apartheid. And we all know how awful that was. And so there are ways in which these words have been misconstrued. And that's why I think we need to find the hope in the story and to put it in the bigger narrative. So that way that doesn't happen again. Because we need to name those things so history doesn't repeat itself. And again, going back to the God of love. That is where I will end every time. You've probably heard it in almost every sermon I've ever preached. If you wonder if I'm repeating myself, probably. It's not that I copy and paste, it's just where it's so important it needs to be repeated, because we often forget. All right, any follow-up questions? I forgot to put my email on the handout, but here it is on the screen if you need it. Yes?
At the end of this chapter, when they say everything to the stone, and then they say the stone will be representative of what you wanted, or it's like the last page.
Page 102. Okay, so it said there is a stone. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. See, he said to all the people, this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words of the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to God. Then Joshua dismissed the people, each to their own inheritance. After these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance, at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of the Ephraim, north of Mount Gahash. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. So you're wondering about that stone. The stone that will be the witness against you if you are untrue to God. So it's kind of the setting of a worship space, essentially. It's remembering all that God had done for them, the good and the bad, all of the words of Moses, like I said, and saying, okay, this is a worship space to remember all of this, to be a place to come back to when you need a reminder in faith. Now, next week, do you think they're going to go against God? Just giving you a fair warning, these next couple of chapters, be thankful the sun is still shining right now, because there's going to be a long haul, which shows a really great arc, but sometimes going through the weeds is a little rough. So thank you so much, everybody.